to make sure that even though African Americans could cast their vote, they would always be in the minority if the white voters in that area were voting the other way. And that is what many of the court battles around enforcing the Voting Rights Act have been about ever since the 1970s and redistricting. But to go back to the machines question, the voting machines is really fascinating to me because it's another thing that's really come out since 2004 in Ken Blackwell. Electronic voting machines, though they increased they were sort of proliferated after the Help America Vote Act was passed and money was given to the states to update their machines in 2002. They had been in place in states like Louisiana and Kentucky and Kansas and other places for many years, but no one just had really paid attention to this question of whether they could be manipulated. But they had been around for a while, and they've now been studied and found that potentially they could be tampered with. And the main focus right now is to make sure when there is an electronic voting machine, they meet certain qualifications for security protections that have been implemented at the federal level from an agency that was created by the Help America Vote Act called the Election Assistance Commission, or the EAC. So my point is that today, electronic voting machines must meet these security requirements. And there's still an ongoing debate about whether or not they're actually secure, but in my view, voter confidence is so low in many places with them anyway that they're not, you can't use them. Optical scan machines, which is what we have here in Michigan, which is a paper ballot that you fill out with a marker and then put through a machine, those have been found to be the most reliable and accurate of all the different voting machine types you could use, in part because they will spit back a ballot that is inaccurately marked, which is great if you're actually there and you haven't voted absentee. You can actually see if your ballot's been rejected and fix it if it has. And then also because there's an actual paper trail to allow for recounts. But like in Minnesota, you'll see that even if those on election day those ballots cast on election day are accurately counted, which isn't always the case, and none are lost, which isn't always the case. Sometimes ballots are still lost, like in Allegan County this past election. But even so, then you still have this debate about absentee ballots. And when people send in their absentee ballots, do they get counted? Do they get counted or rejected correctly? Those sorts of things. So I guess my point is there is no perfect way of counting ballots. The closest to perfection that I can see is optical scan machines with an absentee ballot mechanism that enables people to track their absentee ballots so that if it gets rejected, they're able to find that out and fix it before election day, and then even-handed administrators on the state and local level who are committed only to making sure that the vote is accurate with regards to how it's counted. So it's the people and the machines that I think you need together, and the voters engaged in making sure their vote is counted and cast. That is the closest we can get.
Was there another question?
I actually have two questions. The first is about, you're talking about how there's a lot of kind of resistance on the legislative level here in Michigan towards absentee balloting and kind of alternative things. Do you think that's more of a fiscal thing, fiscal resistance, or is it more cultural or social? And my second thing is that, kind of from an organizer's perspective, I think there's a tremendous amount of interest in the community about surrounding voting rights, but I think that there is still a disconnect in the general population about the idea that a Secretary of State, for example, in Michigan, isn't just about driver's licenses. So how can we overcome that perception that, that the Secretary of State's office is more about just your tabs in your car, but also about your access to voting and things of that nature?
I think just generally, those of us who care and are close to the issues, it's incumbent upon us to try to break down some of those informational barriers. And really, the information's on our side, and that we have the stories of Katherine Harris and Ken Blackwell, but also the stories of Deborah Bowen and Sam Reed, who's a Republican in Washington, who's overseen our recount in a fair way, and Mark Ritchie in Minnesota, to really communicate and highlight the role that they play with regards to elections. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to really spread that message and use it through the anecdotes and the facts that we have on our side. The first question about the legislation, though, and it sort of ties to it, there's a real vacuum of leadership in this state in lots of different ways. And as someone who focuses on voting and is obsessed with just doing whatever I can with my career to continue that work of those activists in Selma, to fight for the Voting Rights Act and make voting and protect that fundamental right to vote, it's frustrating that we don't have stronger voices at the state level and even at the local level about what changes are needed to improve access to the vote and really make our state in line with 30 other states in this country that allow people to vote without requiring them, vote absentee without requiring them to give an excuse. But I've seen legislators like State Senator Gilda Jacobs, like State Representative Rebecca Warren, and others, Republicans and Democrats, seeking to try to push for some of those legislative changes. But like anything, I mean, at least in the past couple of years, if the folks who are chairing the committees, particularly in the state Senate, who oversee the passage of legislation, act proudly as firewalls, as they say, in the words of the senator who sits at the head of the Elections Committee in the state Senate, is a proud firewall towards election reform, then we can't get anything done. And you know, several years ago, I started working on election reform in Michigan and doing several different things on the local level and on the state level. And I sort of came in and said, you know, why can't we get this legislation passed through the state Senate? And people said, well, because the head of the committee won't have a hearing on it. And I thought that was ridiculous. Why can't we have a hearing on legislation? But it really is as simple as that. That there is that the state Senate has not brought up these bills to be talked about or discussed, and even in a hearing setting. And leadership has proudly not done that, and sort of talks about that proudly. So, you know, that I wish that, you know, we could sort of wax poetically about cultural differences and economic, but it's really just that, you know, the leadership in the Senate hasn't brought these bills up for a debate. The reason why they haven't is because voting is about power, and access to the vote is about power. And when you're actually, this is something that, you know, every time there's been a debate in our country's history about voting, it's always about something else other than, it's always articulated in a way other than what it's really about, which is preserving power and limiting access to that power to certain communities. And so to me, you know, what we're seeing in Michigan and the comments that are being made, like, well, we just need to, if Democrats want this reform, then there must be something wrong with it, or, well, our system in Michigan is fine, why do we need to change it? You know, to me, or we need to protect the integrity of the process, and if we allow people to vote early, then that opens it up for fraud. You know, all of these sort of smoke and mirrors, in my view, comments that really mask what's really going on, which is, in my view, perhaps fear of opening up or widening the gates of access to the vote to ensure that more people have access to that power of the vote. And that's why it always sounds hokey to me to say, you know, voting is about power and it's the most important power we all have, but it's true. And when we see limitations on the vote, it's not just that it's going to cost more money or that it's going to, there's a cultural resistance to it. It's that the same arguments that were made in the 1890s. You know, we don't want access. We want to preserve access. We want to protect the integrity of the election. We want to protect the purity of the process. It's all about, you know, in my view, trying to ensure that the laws can affect who has power and who has access to that vote and placing up certain barriers as opposed to taking them down. For me, you know, I just think if everyone in our country is voting, the decisions that are made are better, and the people who are elected are more responsive and accountable. And, you know, that's all that it's about. And I think, you know, anyway, I'm sort of rambling on, but it's very frustrating to me that the people in power today are allowed to get away with not allowing legislation to be passed that would really help our residents, and using, in my view, false and I guess partisan-laced terminology to defend their decisions, when in reality, in my view, it's just a question of, do we want more people voting or not?